Welcome to the Finding the Magic podcast, where books come alive. I'm Tricia Copeland, a fiction author and host of this show. If you love books, finding great reads, and hearing about the story behind the story directly from the authors, this is the place for you. Whether you like fantasy, science fiction, dystopian, or romance titles, I think you'll find something to love in my playlist. Listen in to discover something magical about a book or two today. Welcome, Marco.
Hi, Tricia. Thank you so much for having me. Very
You're
excited to talk to
welcome.
you.
Yeah, me too. Today I have Marco Gamboa on the show. Oh my gosh, what is the title of your book? I would
Within normal limits.
Within Normal Limits. Okay, and it's about living with multiple sclerosis. Is that correct?
Well, yes and no. So, in real life, I have multiple sclerosis, and my name is Marco. In the book, the main character's name is Marco, and he has multiple sclerosis. How we choose to live, the book is 100% fiction. It does
Okay.
not. Yeah, it is someone who goes from bad to worse. And as we talk through it, I can kind of explain why I did that. But in a nutshell, yeah, that's a big sticking point because I can't tell you how many folks have read it. And even though there's a huge disclaimer, the preface says, hey, everything in this book is false. I've had people crying saying like, I can't believe this happened to you. And it's like, no, we didn't. And there's this huge existential moment for fictional Marco where he chops down this tree. And I did chop down a tree. And so everyone was like, oh my God, I can't believe you went through that. I was like, no, the pool guy was gonna raise my rents, to like 400 a month. So it had nothing to do with this, deep meaning behind it. I can't afford the 400 a month instead of the two.
Yeah, chopping down a tree makes sense when you put it in that context.
Yeah. But in the book, it's this very deep moment for Marco of, Marco in the book struggles a lot with faith and at one point he tries Buddhism and for him it, didn't really work out. And that's how the tree goes down. And so, yeah, fun stuff.
We'll dive into the book and the fictional character of Marco then.
Sure. Yeah, it sounds great. Oh, sorry, I cut out for a second. Okay, yeah. So real Marco. I've written my whole life. It was just kind of like a therapeutic thing. I loved, when I was younger, sending folks letters. I lived at a time where, the internet didn't really exist, and so if you miss someone, that's what you do. I still sometimes find it so much easier to on paper write folks letters because verbally I might not be able to. And I think in my head, text has kind of translated into a verbal ability to just you hit send, right? There's no editing process. And so I always did that. First degree I ever got was in English. And so from an academic perspective, they taught us kind of how to try to write. And what ended up happening is you fast forward in 2011, I had my oldest kiddo, and about that time, I started to get real sick, and I became um, agoraphobic because I always felt sick, but then I would go out, feel sick, not be able to kind of explain to people what was happening, and so even when I would go to doctors, I was misdiagnosed as just anxiety, depression for a really long time. I am an anxious individual. I do have depressive qualities from time to time, not really anymore, but that was one of the things where because I was misdiagnosed, I didn't want to go out. I became a recluse. I had this very small, like 1 mile, 2 mile boundary that I would venture out into. And as a kind of therapeutic thing, I started to write these short stories. Originally, the intent was I wanted my kids to understand, like, hey, maybe dad was weird. Maybe dad didn't go out, but dad made this for us, while he was going through that. Well, I finally in 2020, I finally had, well, in 2019, I had crazy like flare up. Now I know it was a flare up. And in 2020, finally had a doctor do the right tests and they identified that it was multiple sclerosis. And then thanks to the medications and so on, like I'm able to lead a pretty normal life now. But I said, that's enough. writing for this. And so I started to show it to friends who, read a lot, or editors who were friends, and said, hey guys, can you kind of give me feedback on how to like finalize this? I know there's so many awesome bookstores where you can send them a PDF and they create like one physical book. And my thought was I'm going to create two, one for my oldest, one for my youngest. And oh, and the reason I bring up my kids in the timeline is because I think that's why doctors for so long were like, oh, it's anxiety, because having kids is terrifying, right? And so um that was kind of the real push why they constantly thought that that's what was happening. Now, I showed it to friends. Friends were like, "Hey, man, I like this, and I think other people might like it too. You should shop it around." And so I did. I started sending it to different folks, and I found a publisher that was like, "We really like this. Can we reorganize it to be a novel, though? Because if you put it this way," I said, "Yeah, sure." And so we did that, got published. And so even though I in my life was able to kind of get out of it, the reason that I wrote this book is, I think, again, from a tangible perspective, I wanted to hand my kids something to kind of as a gift to say like, I'm sorry, but here's this, right? You get to know your dad maybe better this way. At the same time, though, I felt like I fictional Marco lived through what my biggest fears were, which were to never kind of see the other side of it, to not allow myself to have the friendships, relationships that I had, to not be able to stand up for myself. And even though that Marco never really did those things, I wanted to therapeutically sit with that Marco while those things never happened, while improvement never happened. I struggled because I was misdiagnosed for so long. I struggled with being able to tell people like, hey, this is what's going on, and people understanding it. I had amazing friends that sat there with me, but there were also quite a few that were like, dude, this dude's crazy. He's partied too much, and maybe something's just gone wrong, and so yeah, that's how the story came to be. That's the preface of, that Marco. I wanted very much to create some sort of surreal. There's a lot of stuff in there that not only does not exist, but cannot exist. The opening chapter with the virtual reality, that's not a technology that I've ever heard of. It was just some idea of like, what if for a brief second someone didn't feel all the things that the MS was giving them, and what would that reaction be, and things like that. So yeah, that's the background.
Neat. Well, yeah, I definitely understand that misdiagnosis. I have a best friend who was diagnosed with MS 2 years ago, and she had pain and weakness in her back and her legs like 10 years, as long as I knew her. And um, we were in DC, sort of on vacation, walking through the museums, and she was like, my legs, they're tingly. I can't feel them. And then the next day we're walking around, she's like, I'm seeing double. And her husband kept saying, oh, you need to work out more. You need to get stronger. You need all these things. And like literally she drove home like 10 hours the next day. The day after that, she fell on the beach and could not walk. And finally she was diagnosed with this, but it's really scary. And thinking about how horrible your life could be with that disease, and just wrestling with the fact of why me. And so my first series that I wrote was a fictionalized version of my experience with anorexia, so a different kind of mental illness, right? But definitely one that was life-changing, and a little bit of why me as a young person.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I wrote that series too to kind of not only give hope to people that there was recovery, but also to kind of explain the disease and explain what people go through when they're in it, and how the world seems and looks, and how you perceive the world, and all those things that you cannot know unless you've lived through it. And it sounds like that's what you were doing a little bit, like playing out all those worst fears
Yeah.
in a safe space, right? And I think that's what a lot of people may do with a terminal illness. I mean, I'm sure there's like a grief process that you go through, just like losing a friend or a loved one. You're losing a bit of what you thought your life would be.
Yeah, absolutely. The original name of the book was The Long Goodbye.
Ooh.
And and so like to go to your scenario, you know, your friend's husband, people don't have malice behind the suggestions they
Oh
give,
no, no, no,
but
no.
because MS has these weird things that could almost fit into all these dehydration can cause vision problems, dehydration can cause weakness. And so like I live in San Antonio, Texas, where it is unbelievably hot. And a lot of times it was like, well, you're not drinking enough fluids, you're not cooling yourself down. And in my head, I was like, but I'm only outside like 2 or 3 minutes. Like I can be impacted just walking to my car kind of thing. And so that's one of those things where, you know, um, it's so hard to pinpoint, but at the same time, Trisha, your response. So, if I had to guess right now, I've probably within the past 2 months, I've done this is probably like the 18th, 19th podcast, and I dare say about half of them all have my wife, my sister, my brother. There's such an immediate connection to it, but the disease, even though it's prevalent everywhere, it still is such an elusive disease, and it's not the same. I'm part of an MS group here in San Antonio, and you look at us and everyone may have these similar characteristics, but everyone's major pain point is very unique unless you get to like the secondary progressive, which is such a vicious disease because at that point, so like most MS is like a downward curve, but there's kind of these ebbs and flows where you get better but you still decrease and so on, right? With secondary progressive, it is just a straight, very slanted line downwards, right? Where you can no longer kind of like move, you struggle with swallowing, you struggle with, vision. I mean, it's just unfortunately those folks, have it really, really bad. But yeah, I think that that's such a thing that's blown me away. So when the book came out, I made so many connections because people said, well, I know folks with MS, or they would say like, I'm going through a heart thing and I struggle because everyone wants me to be optimistic. But what if? And to me, that therapeutic piece was to look at the worst possible scenario and then take that worst possible scenario and say like, well, what if that is just your story, right? How do you become okay with allowing the story nobody wants to be yours?
Oh,
And
yeah, that's
so,
such a heavy, can be such a heavy topic too, right?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Excuse me.
That's okay. So I mean, does it end on a hopeful note for Marco, or is he kind of just at a places of acceptance? I don't want to give away the ending too much, but
Oh, okay. Well, okay. For the book Marco, no. It ends in a terribly sad place, but it ends in a place where he comes home to something. But one of the things, so here's the really interesting part that's happened with the book. The book is terribly sad. I tell this to everyone. This book is, I feel nowadays with social media and just, all these things, it's so easy to sell a solution. I'm not that solution. The book is for folks to understand that sometimes some people's stories don't get better. But in that, I think to your point, there can be some sort of healing process or acceptance that happens of like, well, how do I still make the best of it? And that's where you can look at like, not me, the real Marco, but people all over the place that do find ways to make that normal a very positive thing, an ability to grow, an ability to kind of, still enjoy life, right? Because at the end of the day, I think that's when you look at the metrics of people with cancer, people with all sorts of chronic illnesses, you see that optimism, outlook on life can very much change that trajectory out, right? You might be able to develop new friendships. You might be able to enrich in old ones, or you might be able to learn something new about yourself. Um, I have a friend who has MS, and his whole life he was an engineer. And in sitting through all this, he realized, like, oh my gosh, I'd be so much more helpful as a therapist because of what I've gone through. So he went from this super lucrative career in engineering for some of these enormous worldwide brands. He was flown all over the world to handle their stuff, to where now he has this, tiny little practice. But his enjoyment of life is through the roof because he gets to sit there with people and really kind of understand what they're going through, what their plight is, and so on.
Wow, yeah, this can be transformative and a way to look at whatever situation we're in. Um, like, yeah, so this is my life. So what do I do now, right? Like,
Exactly, exactly. I think the hardest part is you do lose a lot of mobility. You do lose a lot of functionality, but it's just finding out how to retune life. You can still find happiness. It's just going to look different.
yeah, that's very inspirational. I mean, that's very, and for people in early stages of things and early stages of acceptance of things, that may be really hard when they've lost whatever their norm was.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that you start to also notice is I feel I can tell this for sure from my perspective is that whenever you, I'm sorry, the kids just opened up the alarm. Uh, whenever you, Whenever I was not diagnosed, I had this look on life of like, what do I need to accomplish, right? So it was just very like, I need to run this way and do this and do that. And as I became aware of like, my illness when I went through the agoraphobia thing, one of the things that I noticed is that it's going to look different, but everyone's going through something. And in that vulnerability of people knowing what you're going through and vice versa, you realize that there's this really beautiful ability to kind of slow down time and be more patient with others and show more empathy for others and things like that um and that's something that I've noticed with a lot of again, not specific to MS, but a lot of folks. Writing is such a therapeutic thing for a lot of people, and when you start to hear their writings and you go to readings and you know you see these people put themselves out there, you realize that there is this hope not only for themselves, but for kind of others in similar situations.
Right. Yeah, I definitely realized that in my disease, I was so pigeonholed and I was like, I'm the only one like that's going through this horrible, it was more emotional than physical, but like I just had blinders on and I wouldn't share how I was feeling or what was going on with me. And then I realized through recovery, like, hey, sharing this stuff does connect me to people, does help me
Hmm.
feel better, does help me feel hopeful, or, and I'm not the only one or weird or strange or, whatever that feeling is. So I think there's
Yeah,
power in that relating to other people.
yeah. Now I do have a question for you, going back to kind of the writing, the art of writing. So you said your first book was therapeutic. What I'm struggling with though is I love to write just in general, but I realize that I haven't written from a not therapy perspective in a long time. So how did you kind of move forward and say like, okay, my first book was, this type of therapy, but I love writing. How did you move to that next topic? How did you ever have any type of guilt of like leaving the first project? It's almost like neglecting a child. I don't know if you feel that way about your work, but it almost becomes like this protective nature, not in what how people are going to perceive it, but I don't know, maybe I'm not making sense, but how did you move on to that next project?
Yeah, so and my first project was a series, so it's a 4-book series and it follows the characters through 4 years of college. So she very much wrapped up and had her I'm a happily ever after writer.
Mhm.
So she that very much character very much wrapped up. And I was happy to put that into the world and that be her story. And but then my love of fantasy and all things paranormal and supernatural took over. That's what I love to read. So that's what I started writing next. My next book was like a little bit autobiographical, but a little bit paranormal. So I had an experience as a camp counselor at a camp for the blind. And in my next book, my blind campers had these special um, they were able to read people's minds or hear people's thoughts. So that's kind of how I jumped from like writing, I mean, contemporary realistic fiction to now I write about fairies and vampires and witches. So
Yeah. No, that's awesome. So my kids, okay, so whenever I'm going to do anything, my kids, I feel are like my little mini managers where I'm like, hey guys, what do y'all think about this? And with you, they're very interested because they love the idea of like paranormal. They love, so they actually want to read your books. And I was like, yeah, let's get a hold of them. But oddly enough, so I would go out and do these readings. I would feel awful because there were a couple times where you'd feel people crying, and I'm just like, if they wanted to be sad, they'd buy the book and go be sad on their own, right? Surely no one wants to find babysitters or, everything's so expensive. No one wants to go out and then be sad. So what I started to do was there's a book in the chapter where there's a death for the main character, and he goes to give his speech at the death, and he turns it into a crude joke that was that person's favorite joke growing up. So what I started to do in my readings is I would say like, hey guys, there's this book, there's sad. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Maybe spend a minute and a half on it, and then say the rest of this is just jokes. And I would just have the audience, cracking up. What's really cool, and another reason why I really wanted this to happen with you was it's not my craft. I love paranormal because of my kids, because they're into it. But I actually right now am co-writing a young adult horror series based on Mexican folklore. Again, this is nothing of what I do, but because of the jokes, a comedian that hosted one of the festivals was like, "Hey, can I get a copy of your book?" Yeah, sure. And then we started going back and forth. He's like, "But where do you get the humor?" And so we started to develop a friendship. And then finally, he was like, "Hey, just so you know, like I've been wanting to write this book." He's like, "I can come up with all the material, but I suck at writing." And and I was like, "Well, I don't know the material, but I feel like I'm okay at writing." And so that friendship came up, and that project came up. And so it's interesting to talk to you because I think that aligns closer to what you're doing. But even in writing that book, I can't tell you how many notes he sent me of like, hey, this feels really therapeutic, where like the book really should just be like a very fun, scary, let's have a little like romance in there. Let's have like a little, kids just being kids kind of thing. And so yeah, I think that's another thing where I love that you transitioned almost like to completely different worlds of where the first series came from.
well, yeah, so what is your name of your next book then, and when is it coming out?
So we haven't decided on a name yet, but it should be coming out Halloween 25. We want it to coincide with the holiday. And I think right now we have agreement from the publisher to help push it, and so on. That one will be brand new to me because right now the way that the publisher dealt with it was, hey, you're a small time publisher, so we'll help you with this part, but the marketing, all that stuff, like you kind of got to do it on your own. This one, because of his footprint and his kind of notoriety, they're treating it very differently, where it should feel more like a, hey, we know what marketing levers to pull and so on. And so, but no, we don't have a title yet. Um, we're working through it, but yeah, the hope is to publish it by Halloween of
Oh, fun.
25.
Congratulations.
Thank you, thank you.
Well, definitely have to have you back to talk about that one. But even in my books, I mean, they're very character driven. So all of my characters are struggling with something, whether it's fear or, you know, there's so many things, and they're all these coming of age young adult characters as well. So they have all those, who am I going to be? Where do I fit in? What is my purpose in life? So, I mean, I want to say that a lot of them do have that kind of a little bit of therapeutical aspects. I don't know if you can completely divorce from that when you're talking about human characters. I mean, there is definitely books that are more humorous and just fun and light, but you always have your like character hero journey, right?
Yeah, you do. I think though where I struggle with is in some of these scenarios that we're writing, it is so far removed from my real life that that's the part where like I'm loving, reading other books in the genre. I'm loving, speaking to, like you, other folks where I'm so far removed from it where I'm like, is there really character development? And you're absolutely right. Well, of course there is, right? Because there's a story, there's an arc, there's something that's going to happen. But you know, I think also because I wrote the original book in the form of short stories, it was supposed to be like you walk in, 1-2 punch. I don't know if you ever read like Raymond Carver, where some of his stories are absolutely, some of the most moving things I've ever read. And it's 3 pages, 4 pages. He just tells he the way that I've heard, I don't know how true this is that he had this idea of a story, but then he would focus on an emotion and say like that the real true character of that story is the emotion. And the characters, what happens, that's just kind of the paint that's used to really draw that emotion. It seemed to relate it more to like how he's writing like painting as opposed to kind of the inverse where people think like, oh, when you're looking at a painting, you're looking at it as if it's trying to tell a whole story. But yeah, I think I'm really excited. I hope it comes out in the way that I'm aiming for it to come out. And I would absolutely love to come back and say like, hey, okay, we're done with that sad story, and look what we did, for kids and in this horror sense and folklore. I didn't. I'm Mexican. Like I actually lived in Mexico, been in the States, but there's a lot that I realized like I like I feel like in the States there was the boogeyman, then of course, thanks to so many other movies and stuff, you come up with those types of like horror villains, but I had no idea that Mexican folklore had so many like little stories on like, hey, if your kid's misbehaving, you say this is gonna happen, or hey, your kid's overeating, you say this is gonna happen. And yeah, it was really interesting because we weren't raised that way, even though we're from there.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that sounds really. I have paired with one, my Azrea Aztec priestess is a Aztec mythology, and I paired with an illustrator on that, and it sort of sounds like the connection that you have. Like I just met the person, and what we wanted to say with our art, it being different
Hmm.
types of art, was very similar. Like he was doing a series on goddesses, and so he came up with this Azrea character, and we were like, okay, well, he's Mexican, and so we set it in this Aztec environment, and so it sounds like it came about very similarly to how yours came about.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean like that's super interesting, right? Because you're dealing with, there's some kind of residual pieces of like Aztec stuff, right? But to really like dive into something like that isn't really practiced the way that it used to be. Like you almost get so much freedom to like either go back to the ancient form of it or kind of draw out to the modern interpretations of it. And so yeah, I think that's such an awesome kind of practice to have to dive into those types of things.
Yeah, and definitely writing a novel versus writing a short story is completely different. Like I tried to submit a short story to an anthology, and they were like, "Oh no, you need to fix this." It was really hard for me to dial down to like one plot, one character, or maybe a few accessory characters, and make this in 6 pages. So, yeah.
That's always hard. I've only submitted to like, public like literary magazines and things like that. And that's always really hard because it's not that I'm trying, but a lot of times like from a format perspective, that's the feedback you get of like, well, it's this, these are kind of the requirements that we have. And then for me, it's really hard when it's something like that and I have something in a final format to really kind of maneuver those pieces around. I seem to write so concise. I envy authors who can really dive into like a scene and like, kind of add that extra gristle, that extra flavoring to the story that allows you, if needed, to be able to pull stuff out. And that's something that I hope in this next one I can really to exercise that muscle to be like, hey, let's really dive into like what does the setting look like? What do the colors look like? And then, be able to maneuver that. Because I would love, I'm very I admire very much that you've been able to get published in, anthologies and things like that. Definitely something on my list to try to do one day.
Yeah. Well, it's been super fun having you here, Marco. Tell everyone
Thank
where
you.
we can find you and your book.
Yeah, so very easy. If you go to wnlmarco.com, you'll have my website where you can connect with me. You can connect, and let's say you're like, hey, this book is not anything, that I want to do with, but I know someone with MS. I have MS. You can connect there. I still have a lot of connections with the Multiple Sclerosis Society. So if you need me to help you point in the right direction, I'm happy to do that. You want to connect because of the book, then I'm happy there too. And you'll see all my socials. The book itself, though, your favorite retailer online, you can find Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, just a ton of different places. But yeah, if you want to start, wnlmarco.com.
wnlmarco.com. Thank you so much for being here, and I will definitely have you back next Halloween.
That'd
I'm
be
going to
awesome.
put you on my list.
That works, Tricia. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great day.
Thanks, you too. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Finding the Magic podcast. I'm your host, author and podcaster Tricia Copeland, and I love getting behind the scenes. If you like the podcast, make sure to subscribe and stop in each week to discover new authors and books. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep finding the magic.